Welcome to the Drake Group's webinar series on critical issues in collegiate athletics. Today's discussion, students, employees, or both. Is there an alternative educational model for college sport? Our moderator is attorney Jama Meyer of Simpson, Thatcher & Bartlett.
And welcome everyone. On behalf of the Drake Group, big thanks for joining us today. The Drake Group is an academic think tank that seeks solutions to critical issues in intercollegiate athletics. We've assembled an exceptional panel today to discuss the exceptionally critical issue of aligning the mission of higher education with commercialized sports, while providing athletes a greater voice and greater benefits. More specifically, our focus today is on whether classifying athletes as employees that would entitle them to benefits like wages and overtime pay, and separately provide them with the right to unionize and collectively bargain for rights are workable and desirable solutions that will best ensure that college athletes are not exploited, whether economically, academically, racially, and from health and safety and gender perspectives. Let's consider the context. The biggest spotlight is on the combination of money and amateurism. We hear the oft-repeated position that it's unfair that everyone in the almost $2 billion system is making money except the athletes that produce the revenues. Critics of the current system like to point to athletic department revenues and spending at big-time sports schools and athlete benefits or lack thereof to support this position. At big-time sports schools, revenues and spending unquestionably continue to explode. But that is not true at the vast majority of schools where athletic departments are supported by student fees, institutional or government subsidies, or they just go into debt. We'll discuss those details further. And athlete benefits or lack thereof and amateurism. Well, it was not long ago that due to the NCAA's rules, long justified by the amateurism principles, athletes went to bed hungry. But this is no longer true, at least at the big-time sports schools. In addition to tuition, fees, room, board, and books, college athletes now mostly, as a result of antitrust cases, may receive virtually any benefit as long as it's tethered to education. They may receive a federally calculated cost of attendance stipend at their respective schools, which can range up to $5,000, and academic and athletic awards from schools up to $6,000 for each award. And as of July last year, athletes now may monetize their name, image, and likeness, as long as the payments come from third parties. NIL contracts have totaled many millions of dollars during the last year, although it's possible to know the full extent, given there is no third party collecting the data. But are the athletes entitled to more? Should they be paid to play and receive a share of the media rights revenues like received by professional athletes? Justice Kavanaugh entered this fray by exclaiming in his concurring opinion in the Alston antitrust case that important traditions do not justify the NCAA decision to build a massive money-raising enterprise on the backs of student athletes who are not fairly compensated. Hence, athletes are seeking through the courts, federal and state agencies, and Congress to be classified as employees, to be paid wages and receive other employment benefits, and to have the right to unionize to seek pay and other benefits, including the sharing of revenues. Just yesterday, a bunch of players organized and kicked off a campaign dubbed #FairRevShare. They will also wear an S on their hands during games, seeking an equitable share of revenues. While money does seem to be at the core, as evidenced by the messaging, other work conditions and goals are being sought too, according to a press release. So today we'll discuss what will be gained and what will be lost if college athletes achieve employment status and negotiate to obtain a share of the revenues and other benefits they do not now receive. Indeed, as we all know, college sports is unique. It has many goals. How will employee status and unionization promote or harm those goals? And is it a solution that the system can afford given current spending habits? So further, we will explore if there's an alternative to our current system that would give athletes more of a voice and more rights, but something short of employment status and unionization. There are lots of questions to explore with lots of potential consequences. I'm honored to moderate today this most accomplished group of panelists who will be expressing their own views unless stated otherwise. And I encourage you to read the bios of each of them. The bios are attached to the Drake Group announcement of this session. But let's do quick intros of the panelists. And since I've talked long enough, please, starting with Andy, could you please introduce yourself? And perhaps in addition to very briefly stating your positions or accomplishments that you're most proud of and that are relevant to today's discussion, could you also let us know why this subject is important to you?
Wow. Well, thanks, Jema. I'm Andy Zimbalist. I have been an economics professor at Smith College for a very long time, and I've written a lot and done some consulting in the area of sports in colleges. This subject is important to me in part because I care about equity. It's important to me because I care about education. And it's important to me because I've lived my life as an academic. I also served as the student athletic representative, the faculty athletic representative to the NCAA at Smith College. So Jama also asked me to start with a very brief discussion of how the college economic system works, which seems to be not a relevant factor to talking about how it can be reformed and what the needs are and abilities of it to reform are. I'm going to talk primarily about Division I because I think the issues of unionization and reform primarily apply to Division I. In spite of the fact that so many aspects of college sports are deeply commercial, there are some fundamental differences between the way an athletic department in Division I operates and the way a typical business operates. In college athletic departments, there are no stockholders. Stockholders in a typical corporation want to see profits so they can get dividends and capital gains. But there are no stockholders, there are no owners as such. Instead, there are stakeholders. And what stakeholders want to see is victories. That puts a very different kind of pressure and creates a different dynamic in college sports than in the rest of the US economy. Another characteristic, obviously, is that player compensation has been suppressed forever and ever, although, as Jama points out, is being somewhat relaxed due to a number of factors in the last 10 or 15 years. Because player salaries are suppressed, college athletic departments seek to recruit athletes, induce them to come to their school. They can't use money to do that directly. They can't offer higher salaries. So instead, they try to hire well-known, fancy coaches to appeal to the high school athletes they're trying to recruit or the transfers they're trying to recruit. They also invest a lot of money in fancy facilities. And as Jama alluded to more recently, there are a variety of different perks that they can offer that would attract athletes. And finally, schools are now very deeply engaged in offering support for NILs for athletes to be able to earn additional income. All of this is furthered by a strange system of transfers that exists. Transfers go from the athletes who produce the revenue to coaches, athletic directors, and conference commissioners. In fact, the coaches basically get paid for the market value of the athletes that whom they recruit. There's also a transfer from football programs in Division I and men's basketball programs to non-revenue sports. And finally, there's there's a transfer system that operates from students of color to white students. As a result of the fundamental characteristic that the athletic departments have no stockholders, what happens is that whenever a new pile of money comes to an athletic director, and we all know that new piles of money have been falling on athletic directors for many, many years, they deploy that money to improve the performance of their top teams. mostly men's basketball and football, but some other sports as well. So any new money coming into the department is used to attract new athletes through higher coaches' salaries, through better facilities, and so on and so forth. And as a result of that, the bottom line is red at virtually all the Division I programs. In any given year, you might find 20 to 25 who report a surplus, but that surplus is often reported because they're not counting all capital expenditures and all indirect expenditures. In 2019, the fiscal year 2019, which was the last year before the pandemic, and hence the last year where we can think that is at all representative of what the fundamental issues are, there was a median deficit in athletic departments in Division I, in FBS, a median deficit in FBS of $18.8 million. One department had a deficit as large as $65.3 million. FCS and Division I without football each had median deficits over $14 million. Within FBS, there's a clear distinction between the Group of Five and the Power Five conferences. The Group of Five had a median deficit of $23 million, and the Power Five had a median deficit of $6.97 million. And if you divide FBS into quartiles, you see that the second, third, and fourth quartiles had deficits of 11, 25, and $21 million. And only the top quartile had a deficit that was a surplus of $2.1 million. What do these deficits mean? Fundamentally, they mean that universities have to charge higher athletic fees. They mean that universities have to charge higher tuition. These higher tuition numbers in turn support the growth of student debt. Student debt hit a record of $1.6 trillion last year. They also lead to increasing pressures to cut funding for women's sports and for Olympic sports. So any notion of changing the system or introducing pay for play or other measures to compensate athletes have to take these factors into account. Now, it's true that if you do start paying athletes directly, that what's likely to happen is that the system will adjust. The coaches, for instance, instead of being paid the value of the athletes they recruit, will have lower salaries. But for coaches to get lower salaries, it means that their existing long-term contracts first have to expire, and then the culture in the marketplace has to change. That could take 5, 10, or 15 years, depending on the school. And long-term expenditures on facilities are not going to change as rapidly. So any change that happens in the underlying institutions is going to have some very important effects on the deficits and the overall financing of higher education.
Thank you, Andy. It's very helpful. So let's move to what sort of the gains and losses might be. And Victoria, I was wondering if we could go to you next. If you could please introduce yourself and also let us know why this is important to you. And then can you explain what will unionization, what will the benefits of it be? Where is there needed reform where unionization might play a role?
Hi, thanks. This panel is just awesome, and it's so cool to be on here with all of you. So I just want to acknowledge that first. So I'm Victoria Jackson. I'm a historian. I'm a clinical assistant professor of history at Arizona State University. I'm also a former collegiate and professional track and field athlete. I did my undergraduate work at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I also competed in grad school for ASU. I'm a Tar Heel and a Sun Devil. And the reason this matters to me is quite personal. I was in a PhD program studying the history of civil rights with a focus on education. When Taylor Branch published The Shame of College Sports in 2011 in The Atlantic. And I was reading Taylor Branch's trilogy on America in the King years when that came out. And Taylor Branch is a Tar Heel and I am a Tar Heel. And while Taylor Branch was not the first to call big time college sports a plantation, the first was Harry Edwards, of course. This was a crucial moment in my life and my work. And as a beneficiary of big time college sports and amateurism and Title IX, I feel a responsibility to work to make sure the privileges and benefits I enjoyed are available to all students who play sports. big time college sports are a technicolor illustration of the failure of Brown and the failure of building education equality on the basis of race in the United States. And my experiences tell that story. So I feel very inspired both by my fellow Tar Heels. There are many of us who've been working on this over the years. And, I should say I was at UNC during a high water mark in the academic fraud, unbeknownst to me, which really exposes this bifurcated nature of college sports, something that I've called Jim Crow. The unionization move right now, I think, makes me sad, and I'll explain why it makes me sad. That might sound strange. It's signaling that the schools have failed, that those of us who are in a position tasked with safeguarding athletes and the mission of serving athletes have not been doing that. We've had, looking at this historically, decades upon decades of athletes saying we need guiding principles, we need medical care, we need protections for health and wellness, we need safety measures, we need all of these things. And we've had kind of, in some moments, the schools coming together to say, okay, we'll do these things, but never have we had, from the very top, a leadership model committed to providing benefits and safeguards, prioritizing the health and well-being and educational outcomes of athletes. This last piece is crucial. And, Andy set this up so well by talking about how, so much of the focus on pay has been in the revenue producing sports in the top tiers of colleges. Those athletes represent in FBS football and basketball represent 3.5 of student athletes, but we've failed to serve this group, especially. This group is also a majority Black group now, and their educational outcomes, their graduation rates are far behind both broader student bodies and also their fellow athlete peers. So if we've had all sorts of systems in which we've tried to establish these kind of benefits and safeguards, and it hasn't happened. And so unionization will hopefully do that for these athletes now. If, revenue sharing from media rights is part of that, that's part of it and something that can be negotiated. But to me, what this tells us is higher ed has failed and has failed time and again to do this on their own. It's a failure of leadership, hiding behind kind of the paternalism and home rule that we've seen, as being kind of the reason why an NCAA can't step in. And the schools, of course, are the NCAA. So it's the schools finding a way out to do what's right by athletes.
Thank you. Michelle Roberts, can you please introduce yourself? Tell us why this is important. And then sticking with the question about what are the benefits of unionization, based on your experience, what will they be in the college area? What could they be in the college area? And you might be on mute.
Thank you. I was on mute. So good afternoon. I'm Michelle Roberts, and the minute I tell you what I've just resigned from doing, you'll know exactly why this is important to me. Up until January of this year, I had for 8 years been the executive director of the National Basketball Players Association. That is the union that represents professional athletes who play in the NBA. And obviously, there is no doubt, I think, that the NBPA, which is the name of the union that I directed, was of significant value to the athletes that were members of that union. I will say this, from almost day one of my tenure at the NBPA, I was approached by a number of people who had been already very heavily immersed in the unionization of college athletes movement. And I had not been familiar with those efforts before. So I ended up spending a lot of time learning and talking to and listening to the folks in that space. And it didn't take long for me to conclude that something that Victoria said just a few minutes ago was true. to the extent there was a notion that amateurism needed to distinguish the college athlete from the professional athlete, then it seemed to me that the universities, the colleges themselves had a responsibility to make sure that the things that these athletes were otherwise suggesting could only come to them through unionization, those universities had the obligation to provide that. And they weren't doing it, not at any meaningful level. I'm not suggesting that there aren't great schools and great athletic departments that do very well by the student athletes. But overall, there is a problem with that happening in any meaningful way across the board. A union, by definition, permits for the possibility of that being addressed, because a union, by definition, has as its responsibility to work on improving the conditions of employment of its members. So the items that Victoria referenced, medical and mental wellness and medical wellness, academic support, those are the kinds of things that would be on the to-do list of a union. Now, I'd also make the point that I, to the extent I have any experience thinking about these issues, I will confess that I've been thinking about these issues and talking about these issues from the perspective of a Division I athlete. I appreciate that they are a sliver of the entire student athlete population, but to the extent it's generated a lot more conversation, it is because of the numbers. It is because of the revenue that's generated by these schools. And Andy, I'll take you at your word, because you know more about this than I do, but that these schools are at the end of the day losing money. I know they're making it. They may not be showing a positive on the books, but there's so much money being generated by some of these schools that it's very difficult for people not to find it unfair for students not to be otherwise provided some of the items that are on that list of things that students want. So, I've been a fan of unions forever. And I had never bought in, to the extent I began to look at this question, I've never bought into the notion that there was no place for a union within the context of the student athletic community. And in fact, I think unless the universities are going to collectively figure out a way to address some of these issues, that this may be the only answer.
As long as we've got your mic unmuted, I'm going to throw in a question received from the audience. And it is, how can professional sports unions support the college athletes unions or attempt to unionize?
I mean, we would not be, and I won't go into the minutia. There are conflict issues that we don't want to, that we have to resolve. And I think they'd probably not be resolvable. But I will say this, that even among the professional players associations, there is mutual support. And I don't mean financial support, but mutual support in terms of strengthening the other's issues or positions as they negotiate with their leagues. I would have in a New York second, had I still been at the PA, been willing to work with these groups, and there are a couple of groups that are more significant than others, and I've talked to them, but helping them figure out how to manage the process of becoming unionized. But there's no lacking of support among the professional associations for these students. We just legally can't touch them. I mean, if nothing else, we would potentially damage their eligibility to play if we would engage in some substantive conversations and relationships with these students. But if and when it happens, and I'd like to say when, I think they will be greeted with open arms.
Excellent, excellent. So Len Simon, can you please introduce yourself, why this is important? And then I'd like to flip to the other side a little bit, the bargaining unit. I'd like to look at this from the employer's standpoint, whether it's the schools, conferences, or the NCAA. I mean, you recently wrote that we should be careful what we wish for sometimes. Can you explain what you meant by this? And tell us about the silver lining you referred to.
Sure. Let me start with who I am. I'm a lawyer in San Diego. I'm also an adjunct law professor. I've taught sports in the law or complex civil litigation every other semester for about 20 years. At Duke, I am a Blue Devil rather than a Tar Heel, so we have both sides of that covered. And at the University of San Diego, which is a whole lot closer to my front door than Duke, which is my law school alma mater, but I went to undergraduate school at a D3 school. So I've seen D3 up close. I've seen D1 up close. I've represented and sued sports organizations, sued the NFL, sued the NCAA, represented Callaway Golf, represented several athletes, represented agents. I've been on all sides of sports litigation, and I do a lot of antitrust work. Why do I care? I'm a sports fan, number one. Been a sports fan as long as I can remember. Hooked on sports. I was a sports writer. That was my part-time job when I was in high school and college. To make walking around money was to be a professional sports writer for newspapers in the East. I've been to NCAA tournaments in many what we call minor or Olympic sports, as well as the Final Four and bowls and things like that. I enjoy the competition. I am a non-fan of the NCAA. As soon as I sort of understood who they were and I was a grown-up, I thought they were fumbling over and over and over again their opportunities. And when I saw that the issue of NIL bubbling up decades before many other people saw it coming, because if you teach sports law, you see Jeremy Bloom and other people, Andy Oliver, fighting about NIL really, as I say, decades and decades ago. I thought the NCAA was wrong. I thought the students were getting the short end of the stick, and it was a potential compromise area between those who wanted competitive salaries and those who wanted pure amateurism. So I helped Nancy Skinner with the passage of Senate Bill 206 in California, the first law that permitted college athletes to monetize their name, image, and likeness. And I write a lot of op-eds on sports-related subjects, a heck of a lot of them about NIL and amateurism in the last 3 years, but on a variety of sports before that. Unionization, two-sided. I mean, what I think about unionization is it's really a complex ball of wax. It's not obvious what bargaining unit would be. Is it all NCAA athletes? No. All Division I athletes? Maybe. Still pretty big. Football players? Maybe. D1 football players, I think, is an arguable bargaining unit. D1 basketball players, arguable. But of course, we do have Power Five and Group of Five and all of that. And the interests of the players are different. So it's a tricky issue as to how many unions we would need to cover the unionizable athletes. I mean, it may be that, cross-country runners at Kenyon College do not really need a union and may not want a union. So we may not have to cover everything in every division, but it's a very difficult issue. Second, it's obviously good for the athletes and bad for the NCAA in one way, which is it provides the athletes leverage. A union has leverage. They can speak with one voice and they can demand additional food, additional medical care, additional pay, better NIL opportunities, whatever it might be. What is the downside for the athletes? Well, I'm an antitrust lawyer, and they lose all their antitrust rights. Anything in a collective bargaining agreement is immune from antitrust law. And so we've seen a huge flip. When Alston's over, everybody changes sides of the table or thinks about it. Because before Alston, the athletes were making very slow, incremental progress or none in antitrust cases. They were losing or they were getting nickels. And so, do you want a union? Hell yeah, I want a union. My union will get me something good. Now, and the NCAA's position would be the converse. Hell no, I don't want a union. I don't want to negotiate with these athletes. Now, with Alston on the books and Kavanaugh's concurring opinion on the books, the sides almost flip. So, do you want a union? Ask a college athletic director if he wants a union. You'll get, he or she will get 3 different answers from 3 different people. Yes, no, and maybe, because someone has explained to them the antitrust immunity, and they realize they will never again be sued over antitrust issues, which is important to them because they appear to be on a losing streak. And Kavanaugh is predicting a continued and long and expensive losing streak. So I think unions have obvious benefit for the athletes. That's why Ramogi Yuma is pushing for unionization, and some benefits for the NCAA used properly with a proper bargaining unit, in that they get away from antitrust law. And if you look at the history of the NFL or the NBA or the NHL, they fought the unions, they got unionized, and they found then that at least they got rid of the antitrust cases. So I think I've talked too long and I should stop, but that's who I am. That's what I think. That's why I'm here.
That's very helpful. And we'll come back to that. Where is the right balance? Are the athletes better off having antitrust rights? Gabe Feldman, please tell us a little bit about yourself and why this is important. And then I'm hoping that you could give us the legal 101 version of what Andy gave us when it came to economics. There's so much going on in this area, in the courts and in the federal and state agencies. So Gabe, I turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Jema. And thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel. It's great to see my fellow panelists. I'm going to start, before I even say who I am, acknowledging that Len and I are both fellow Duke alum, but that I think Len and I are talking to different athletic directors, because I have not talked to many athletic directors who want athletes to unionize. I think most athletic directors very much fear what unionization means, both in terms of the financial situation and how much they will be required to pay to the athletes, what it means in terms of the relationship between the coach and the athlete and what an employment relationship does, what it does to the academic requirements, what it might do to Title IX, what it does to broad-based opportunities. So we may just be talking to different ADs, but all the ADs I have said, talked to want no unionization, no antitrust lawsuits, but what they want is help from Congress. So we'll talk about whether that may come or not. But I don't know that they're seeing it as, oh, unionization might be great for us because then we don't have to worry about the next antitrust lawsuit. But we can talk about that more in a minute. Who am I? I am, other than someone who disagrees with a friend before I even introduce myself, I am the director of the Tulane Sports Law Program. I was a litigator for a little bit, doing mostly sports litigation, and I've been teaching ever since, and I've been teaching sports law and studying and writing and researching about sports law ever since, with a focus on antitrust and labor issues and intellectual property. Over the last 10 years or so, more of a focus even on college sports. I am a consultant for the Knight Commission, and in that capacity, I was asked, actually prior to that capacity, I was asked to write a white paper for them back in 2016 on why college athletes should be allowed to receive money for their name, image, and likeness, and how it might happen. And then that led to a consulting role, which continues with the Knight Commission. I've also served as the reporter or the drafter for the Uniform Law Commission and their act on name, image, and likeness and how to provide a uniform state law. And I'm the associate provost for NCAA compliance here at Tulane, so I oversee our NCAA compliance office. I've been involved in a number of NCAA committees and other stuff that you can read in my bio. But why I'm here, why I care about this issue, I think Len expressed it really well. And I think college sports are really important. I think college sports are really valuable. I think sports in general are really valuable. I otherwise wouldn't have dedicated most of my career to studying it and teaching it. And I think it's important for a lot of different reasons, and college sports in particular. I think it's important for the role it plays on a college campus, or I should say the role it can play, the role maybe it has played in the past, the role it could play in the future, maybe the role it's not playing so well right now. I think it's important for the academic community. I think it's important for the students. I think it's important for the alumni. I think it's important for unifying people. I just think there are endless things that are valuable about college athletics. And I do think it is a unique and important and vital part of our academic system here in this country. And I want to help protect it, and I want to help enhance it. And I want to do that while also ensuring that college athletes are receiving fair treatment and equitable treatment along racial lines, along gender lines, along every possible line you can think of. And I think there's a long way we can go from where we are now and what is a fair system that will provide more rights for college athletes while also maintaining what we all love about college sports. I think there's a lot that we can do. I think there's a lot that needs to be done. And I think if it's not done quickly, we might lose a lot of what we love about college sports, and we might lose opportunities for the athletes to play. In terms of the labor law 101, and I'll try to do this in a minute, which usually sort of like dog ears, it will be more like 7 minutes, but I'll try to keep it as brief as possible just to set up the rest of the conversation. And when we're talking about employment status, we're talking about two different federal regimes. One is the National Labor Relations Act, and the other is the Fair Labor Standards Act. When we talk about the right to unionize, that comes from the National Labor Relations Act, the NLRA. That gives employees the right to form a union and then collectively bargain, and then requires, as Michelle said earlier, that their employer engage in good faith collective bargaining over wages, hours, other terms and conditions of employment. And as Len said, the union, the collective of these individual employees, gives them leverage they wouldn't otherwise have if they had to compete with each other. And early unions formed typically where you had mostly fungible employees. The skills were relatively easily replaced. So the employer could play one employee off of another to push down their salaries, push down their terms and conditions of employment, because no individual employee had any leverage against the much larger, more powerful employer. So the union gave the employees leverage. It's a little bit different in the pro sports context, as Michelle can tell you that she lived for 8+ years, that pro athletes, particularly the star pro athletes, have more negotiating power than the typical non-athlete employee, because unlike the postal worker, LeBron James is much more difficult to replace and has a much shorter career, and he's not fungible or interchangeable with many other athletes. So when those athletes come together to form a union, they do it to gain leverage, but they also maintain the right to negotiate individual player contracts, which you don't typically see in the non-athletic context. Now, it's all within the confines of the collective bargaining agreement and salary caps and restrictions on compensation and movement, but there's a difference between the athlete union and the non-athlete union. Lots of other differences, lots of similarities as well. The other federal regime is the Fair Labor Standards Act, which can also declare someone an employee. And if you're an employee under the FLSA, you're entitled to minimum wage and overtime. You don't get the right to unionize under FLSA, and you don't get the right to minimum wage under NLRA. But you can get both of those rights separately. And we are seeing college athletes proceed on both tracks. The NLRA track first came to most prominence with the Northwestern football players, who tried to file a petition to be recognized as employees and then to collectively bargain. They were originally recognized as employees by the regional director, and then the National Labor Relations Board said this issue is too complicated because the NLRA only applies to private employers. Most FBS schools are public, so we'd end up with a situation where athletes at private schools like Northwestern could unionize, but athletes at public schools may not be able to, depending on what their state law said. So they just said it wouldn't further the purpose of labor law to recognize college athletes as as employees under the NLRA. So they punted. But more recently, the general counsel of the NLRB wrote a memo that said, I think college athletes are employees under the NLRA, and I think they should unionize, and I think they should engage in collective bargaining, and warned the NCAA that even referring to them as student athletes might be a violation of labor law because it might be chilling or interfering with their right to form a union or to be recognized as employees. There have not been any efforts by athletes themselves that I'm aware of to create a union or to file unfair labor practice charges, but we have seen two organizations that are, at least in theory, representing college athletes that have filed unfair labor practice charges under the NLRA. Last point I'll make about the NLRA and that private-public distinction is the general counsel of the NLRA said, the NLRB, said, well, there's a way to get around that if we identify the conference or the NCAA as a joint employer, then they're all private employers because every conference is a private entity. And if the conference is a joint employer, that means that every college athlete, even those at public schools who are part of a conference, have the right to unionize. And then the other track is FLSA, and that's being litigated right now in the Johnson case. It's up on appeal in the Third Circuit on the question of whether college athletes are employees under the FLSA. One interesting point about the FLSA case is if it proceeds and if the athletes are successful, they'll be recognized as employees, will have the right to minimum wage, overtime, not necessarily the right to unionize. That could come separately. But the plaintiffs in that case are not the FBS football players. They're not the Division I basketball players. The named plaintiff is a former Villanova football player. And then there are Sacred Heart, Cornell, Lafayette athletes in Olympic sports. That would decide essentially whether all athletes in Division I, and whether you are on scholarship or not, because there's an Ivy League athlete in there, whether all of them are employees for purposes of the FLSA. So even though it may be football and basketball driving this train, there is still the possibility that this could apply to all athletes at the D1 level, maybe even D2 and D3, not just those high-end revenue generating football and basketball players primarily. So my 1 minute turned into 7, turned into maybe 8 or 9, but that's the quick summary.
Excellent, excellent. I would like to just point out there actually are 2 other tracks that the same person who has filed the petition and is behind most of the efforts for unionization has also filed a complaint with DOJ under the antitrust laws, saying that the athletes should be compensated, and it's both a civil and criminal violation of the antitrust laws that they are not so being compensated. And he has also filed a lawsuit or a complaint with the DOE that then got transferred over to EEOC, saying that it's a civil rights violation. So there's a lot in this space going on legally. And then Jamie, just one more thing. There's also the House case, which is the big NIL case that is currently pending, which is an antitrust suit. I was just focused on the 2 employment tracks, but yes, there are many other tracks, including federal intervention, state legislation. There are lots of other paths that might lead to more athlete rights. And
Gemma,
yeah, go ahead.
Can I jump in quickly with a comment? I agree with Len's position on unionization, but I disagree with one point. Maybe I would like to amend one point, which is that unions can decertify. And they did that in the NFL in the McNeil case. And I was working for 8 years during 2 different collective bargaining periods with the NBPA when Billy Hunter, who preceded Michelle, was the head. And we had very active discussions about decertification. So it's possible to have a union and then decertify and bring antitrust concerns.
It's also just to add on Andy's point, MLS players made a decision when MLS first formed. They brought an antitrust suit first and tried to claim that the restrictions on player salaries were illegal. MLS argued that they were a single entity and you couldn't bring the suit. The suit ended up that their antitrust suit didn't go anywhere, so they formed a union. But they had the choice, and that's what labor law is supposed to do. If you're an employee, is give you the choice to either be in a union and take advantage of labor law, or not be in a union, and then you can bring your antitrust suit. Right now, the problem for college athletes, up and maybe till Alston, was they didn't have either avenue. They weren't winning an antitrust law, and they weren't employees, so they didn't really have access to antitrust law or labor law. Now we may be looking at a case where they might have access to both.
This is really a question for anyone. The big weapon that I understand, at least in unionization, is the ability to strike, or from the employer's standpoint, to lock out the athletes. Do you think that should be included in any kind of collective bargaining with college athletes? And if it's not, how potent will this be?
If nobody else wants to jump in, I will give it a try. Lockouts and strikes are the ultimate weapon in labor law, but I suppose if what we're thinking is that Congress is going to solve this, which I have to say, Gabe, that's the reason a lot of my athletic directors, or at least were willing to think about unionization, because they think Congress will never get anything done. And so their choices are to keep fighting cases like House, which could cost them a huge amount of money, or ultimately come to some resolution. But Jema, if Congress is going to give the athletes power to form unions, you can give the athletes power to do that with strings, and a string could be binding arbitration instead of strikes and lockouts. So, I mean, Michelle could talk about this, at some length. And I've got some experience also with decertifications of unions in the NBA or threaten decertification. It's a sloppy system. Whenever there's a strike or a lockout, there's more losers than winners. And it's just the last big hammer for one side or the other to try to hammer the other side to agree to their terms. Sooner or later, a deal gets done and everybody wishes there hadn't been a strike or a lockout. So if the players are going to get the right to bargain, get the right to unionize from the NLRB, they are going to have the right to strike, and the employers are going to have the right to lock them out. That's part and parcel of that. If they're going to get the right from Congress in some kind of a compromise package, anything is possible. And it does seem like it seems like a terrible look to have, the Michigan football team going on strike 2 weeks before the Rose Bowl or whatever. So I can imagine you might actually get a majority of Congress to think that if you got a majority of Congress past the other issue, which is, do they like unionization or not?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I absolutely agree that if you're finding yourself locking out your players or you're decertifying your union, then the negotiations have failed. And nobody wants to be there ever, but it is leverage. And to the extent that be any restriction on a student union being able to have that leverage, then it would be a restriction on the leverage. I agree. If Congress can come up with something that would not, while it reduces the leverage that necessarily comes with being able to strike, but still is able to act as a carrot for the university, the league, whatever, the association, then that's fine. But I would not begin the discussion by saying, okay, you can unionize, but you cannot strike. I mean, it's immediately taking away some of the greatest leverage that one has, even though, again, we'd all agree that we hate to have to exercise it.
If there's
Yeah, I would.
Go ahead.
Oh,
No,
so yeah, I was just going to say that I agree with everything that's been said, and I think the idea of restricting the athletes' right to strike when their strike possibilities, James, as you mentioned, is so weak to begin with, given the length of their careers and how much you'd be asking of an 18 or 19-year-old to sacrifice, where they may not actually get the benefit of it because their career will be over. But if you look at the airline industry, you look at sort of essential workers and what we do to try to maintain them working, because it's life and death. Whereas for many people, college football is life and death, but it's not really life and death. That there are mechanisms in place to make it so the contract doesn't expire, that you continue to operate, that there is mandatory mediation, potentially arbitration. So I think there are mechanisms if we get there. But the other thing I'd say is that let's not overlook the power of collective action without a union. And there's no question that the NBA players and Major League Baseball players and lots of employees could not have gotten what they've gotten without their unions. Right? There's no question. But there's also power if you don't have a union, because people who are independent contractors don't have the right to unionize, but they're still able to exert some leverage. And we've seen it with college athletes. You mentioned this S move. We saw it with George Floyd. We saw it starting in 1936. The Howard football team went on strike because they weren't being given food. And the president at the time said, we don't want to professionalize college football by giving you food. So they went on strike and refused to play, and they gave in and gave them food. And in 1972, the Washington football team refused to come out during halftime of a game because they wanted to protest the Vietnam War and make an announcement over the loudspeaker. And they said, all right, we really want this game to happen. So go ahead, make the announcement. And it's that collective action. Now, that's potentially an antitrust violation if all of the athletes get together. But if an individual team is doing it, or athletes within a conference are doing it, there are lots of things that athletes can do now to affect change short of forming a union. And I think Ramogi is an example of that. Ramogi's group is not a union, and yet he's been able to help affect a lot of change. And I don't think Len would have been called into California to help Nancy Skinner if Ramogi hadn't been there. And so I do think there is still a lot athletes can do. There is a lot they've already done. I think we've seen a lot of change. Unionization may be inevitable, and maybe not. But I don't think it's the only avenue that athletes can resort to if they want to expedite this change.
But before we do get to solutions, I'd like to touch upon another mechanism and how it fits into college athletics. Michelle, certainly there are so many issues intended to preserve competitive balance in CBAs and professional sports, whether it's salary caps, team caps, luxury taxes, drafts, revenue sharing, all those types of things. How would that all play into the college athletic landscape? How do we, to the extent we have it, preserve competitive balance if we have unionization?
Well, that brings to mind something that I think Gabe mentioned. It may have been Len. The first question is, what does this union look like, right? I mean, if it's a union of all college athletes throughout the country, private, public, and I think that's probably not workable. But if it's something that the structure looks like that, then I think it's tough. I don't, and I haven't thought about this too much. I think at the end of the day, we're probably needing to, but if we're talking about how to affect those issues, how to maintain competitive balance. I mean, right now there is no competitive balance in college sports. Duke is not competing with Wesleyan University for athletes, right? And has no right to in any significant way. And the CBA that governs the NBA, because of draft, because of a number of other issues, there's an artificial way of maintaining competitive balance that does not exist, and I don't think can be made to exist at the college level, depending upon how the union looks. My own sense is that that any union would be one that is either confined to the conference, maybe even has different classes of sport within it. But I don't think we can look at the model that exists on the professional side and try to duplicate that model exactly, because I just think it's unworkable. If nothing else, the numbers are overwhelming, but the differences in between universities and sports and women and men, I don't think realistically we can say, okay, let's make something that looks just like the NBA or just like the NFL or just like hockey, and just superimpose that model on the college athletics system. It's not going to work. I think it's going to be very, very different from what we're accustomed to on the professional side. And so I don't think we begin by saying, how do we maintain competitive balance in college athletic? I don't even know how to begin that discussion in any meaningful way.
No, that was helpful. Victoria, can you talk to us about what the Title IX implications would be if revenue producing sports unionize and receive additional cash benefits?
Sure. And first, I do think there's a model for thinking about it. It's not the same language. Competitive balance isn't the same language, but in European soccer, we have financial fair play. And there's a kind of a different model of like thinking about what's fairness within the realms of competition and professional sports. So I always kind of look to European football when I'm thinking about college sports rather than professional leagues in the US, because I think there's more in common historically and culturally between American colleges and football clubs. Yeah, I think I would want to take this question of the relationship between, potential unionization and revenue sharing with athletes in football and basketball, that relationship with women's sports and also Olympic sports together. I think, what's so wonderful about the model we have in the United States, unique in the world, of elite sport development in schools and an educational civil rights law on the basis of gender, is that we have a system in which, girls have had an opportunity to play competitive elite sport, not for a half century now, but maybe for the last 30 to 40 years. And that's wonderful. And, that history of the people behind women's college sports trying to hold to a scholastic sport model and an educational serving students who play sports philosophy and kind of, the eschewing of that with the launch of NCAA championships. There's a lot of lessons in there. But I think in what's happened since is a distortion of that mission. And, what Andy had talked about in the setup is this wealth transfer. And, the women who've benefited the most from Title IX are women and girls who grew up in places like I did, the segregated suburbs, that attended public schools with lots of resources, offering the sports that offer scholarships in colleges. So it's a perpetuation of privilege is what we've kind of, what's being reproduced by American college sports is what's happening in American higher education. And, the Supreme Court is talking about this right now. And the groups that get a leg up in the admissions process, why athletes is one of them, is a very strange thing that we should be questioning, honestly. Why they do instead of theater students or that sort of thing. This is a very roundabout way of saying, I think in order to really get this right in a responsible manner to serve all of our students who play sports and also those who crave those elite competitive opportunities and experiences, is that we need college sports redesigned to be one piece of a broader puzzle. I think the fact that we're pretending everything under this umbrella is the same and all athletes are deserving of the same benefits is wrong. And it's a product of, this distortion of amateurism ideology over time. And I think there's opportunity in redesign for Olympic sports. I'm going to tap into one of the questions that I saw in the Q&A. I think this is an opportunity to rethink the subsidization of Olympic sports too. And that there's, that athletes in Olympic sports, like football players, shouldn't have to pay for their opportunities anymore, is kind of the foundation of what I'm saying. And we've, as a product of the Cold War and exaggerating our differences with the Soviets, we have a privatized form of Olympic sports development in the United States. And we don't need that anymore. I think public funds run through universities, like public monies are coming through universities in all sorts of ways. And supporting the Olympic sport in a top tier sort of way is a good way to address what has been an exploitative, harmful wealth transfer relationship. And honestly, I think it also opens up an ability for schools to get back to that mission of providing lots of sporting opportunities. This focus on elite competitive sports has actually decreased participation opportunities on college campuses. And we're not serving all of our students who want to play sports. There used to be freshman teams and JV teams and lots of participation opportunities. And so I think a two-tier model in the Olympic sports, that we're able to think about this stuff if we focus on fixing what's happening in the football and basketball space. It provides opportunity for us to get creative and better serve all of our students. Sorry, I said that I wasn't going to go off on a different trajectory and make this bigger than it needed to be, and I just did. So I apologize.
That's fine.
I can't help it sometimes.
It's all fine. I do want to get to questions at the end, but I would like us to quickly talk about what you think are the right solutions to the extent you've not already mentioned them. I know we've talked about Congress a little bit here. Would somebody like to talk more about the College Athlete Right to Organize Act that Senator Murphy has suggested, or maybe just throw out what you think the right solution is and how do we get there?
I'll take a stab at that if I could. I think it's important to remember that this is all supposed to be about education, and that fewer than 2% of football and men's basketball players in the NCAA ever play a single game in the NBA or the NFL. And focusing on collective bargaining and how it might help the top tier of players who do get exploited takes us away from what we're supposed to be talking about. And I think that the athletes who really get exploited in college are the ones, mostly are the ones who are going to be working in the NBA and the NFL and making very handsome salaries. The main thing I'm worried about with regard to their futures and their livelihood is that if they get injured in college, that they'll undermine their ability to earn money as professionals. And I think one of the things that we should be doing is promoting loss of income insurance for college athletes, for those who are ranked high enough to be recruited or drafted in the professional ranks. At the end of the day, the best thing that we can do to prevent college athletes from being exploited is to protect their health and safety. Right now, 1% of NCAA revenues are dedicated to health and safety. And there are over 100 lawsuits connected to concussions from athletes. That has to be addressed. The proper and robust education of college athletes has to be addressed. Worrying about whether unions can come along and maybe bargain for some direct pay for some of their members, and we don't know what the bargaining unit would be. Rather than worrying about that, we should be worried about education and health and safety. I don't think this is at all true of the NBA, NBPA, where I worked, and I've worked with other sports unions, which I think are largely Democratic unions, but a lot of unions in this country are not Democratic. And when you're talking about representing the interests of transient students who are going to be around for 2, 3, or 4 years, it's not likely that it's going to be a very participatory union and a representative union. And I think what we need to be doing here is passing legislation as adults that make sure that athletes are not exploited in taking advantage of their body and in reneging on the promise that these athletes are signed on to when they sign for colleges, which is to give them a robust education and a college degree. I think that's where the appropriate energy should be going, and not to the unionization question.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in, I agree with almost everything Andy said. I won't highlight what I don't agree with, but I agree with almost all of it. And this is a rarity. We've been over an hour and we've barely mentioned the NCAA and the NCAA's role in all of this. And I do think the NCAA, despite their transformation committee and despite all good intentions they may have failed college athletes in a lot of ways and failed college sports in a lot of ways. And I think the issues we're seeing are in large part structural. And I think the system is set up so that schools are joining conferences to chase football money and then using that football money to generate more football money. And that all decisions are following that. And those decisions are not being made at all with the things that Andy mentioned in mind. They're not made to protect the athlete health and safety, physical or mental. They're not designed to enhance the educational opportunities for athletes. If anything, they're in conflict with all of those goals. So I just think let's, even though we did it for an hour and 5 minutes, let's not let the NCAA off the hook here. There are changes that they can be making, the conferences can be making. The Knight Commission, I'm biased here, but I think they put out one of the only specific proposals to actually better align college athletics with academics in their care model, and to ensure that a percentage of revenue is being used on college athlete health and safety and education. So figure out a way to align academics and athletics. I think Victoria also mentioned something that I've been working on and others as well, just trying to figure out if we can extract more of the academic value out of athletics and figure out, can we make athletics a serious field of academic study like music and theater and art? And if it's not, why is it not? And are there racial aspects to that? What are the other aspects of it that are preventing us from allowing college athletes to earn a really valuable education through athletics? Not the intangible stuff, not the stuff that they just get because they're playing, leadership, all the really important stuff. But how do we formalize it? And how do we make it so that they are getting their end of the bargain, right? The idea that it's a free education, but is it an actual education? Are they getting the opportunity to receive that full education? So I just think there are so many changes that can be made now that don't require unionization, that don't require federal legislation. They just require a commitment from the conferences, from the NCAA, to see themselves as part of college athletics, to see that as part of a academic enterprise, a social enterprise, not a for-profit enterprise. And as long as they continue to see themselves as trying to make the most money possible to then pay themselves even more money, I don't think we're going to be able to fix anything short of some catastrophic, and I don't mean catastrophic in terms of the impact of it, but some major shift forced on it by Congress, by the courts, by a federal agency. And then that's in many ways the worst case, because then you lose control. And I think what we'd like to see is the people who know what they're doing, who know about the industry, to have a voice in this, for the athletes to have a role, for folks within the NCAA to have a role, for experts outside of the NCAA to have a role. And let's figure out a way we can fix the system before it collapses on itself.
The problem with that is the NCAA has had opportunities for the last 115 years to make those changes, and they've
had, but they've never had.
The reason they don't is because they operate as a trade association for coaches, conference commissioners, and athletic directors, and they'll always operate that way, and they have to be forced to change. So you need an outside force, is my view. I just don't think the NCAA has it within them. I know that the transformation committee that was supposed to come out with a report in mid-October, that as of the first week in November, a representative that came to speak to an FAR conference about the transformation committee said they hadn't done anything, and they were hoping to have something before the meeting in January. But to the extent that they're having any discussions at all, they're about the most minor tweaks about the transfer window and whether it should be May 1st or May 10th or whatever. So I agree, it would be lovely if the people who have been involved in the industry could define a path of change, but they never have, and I doubt that they ever will.
Well, here's why I think it might be different right now, is because this is the meme. My students roll their eyes when I try to be hip and cool and do internet memes, but the dog in the fire saying this is fine, and the idea that, well, we can wait for the crisis, and then once the crisis gets here, we'll change. The crisis is here. When you have a unanimous Supreme Court with Justice Kavanaugh issuing one of the most scathing concurring opinions in the history of at least sports law, and you have Congress, and you have state legislators, and continuously, and you have multiple lawsuits, I don't know what else to tell you other than you're in the fire. The crisis is here. And if you don't change now, you're going to lose control. I think that's the difference between now and the last 100 and whatever years. They haven't faced all these challenges at the same time.
There was a pretty strong message in the 1984 Supreme Court decision.
But that was one. And that was that. Even in that strong message, it said athletes must not be paid.
There's lots of other stuff going on as well. Other people need to jump in here.
Gabe, can I just ask quickly, Gabe, though? I agree with everything that you've said but how do we get there without an antitrust exemption? How can you place those controls and guidelines into place?
Yeah, James, I agree completely. I think that obviously you can solve some of the problems internally. The health problems, health and safety are huge. But talking about the economic problems, it's got to be Congress or it's got to be unionization, because someone has to put a stop to the madness now in which the NCAA is either on a losing streak and will lose forever, or is afraid that they're on a losing streak and is unwilling to act, because any act they take could be a violation of the antitrust laws. I think Congress is really hard, because there are congressmen who are very supportive of athletes' rights and talking to Ramogi, and there are congressmen who are, from Alabama and Mississippi and get their instructions from the athletic directors and the head football coaches there who don't agree with Ramogi on a time of day. And but I think you got to try, and unionization is going to bounce along on its own, on its own path. The general counsel of the NLRB doesn't care what all of us think. She cares what she thinks labor law means, and it may be coming. So you've got sort of these two trains out there that potentially have a result, and maybe a positive result, maybe a negative, maybe a neutral, but unionization would get us something different. We don't know exactly what. Congress would get us something different. If you get no unions and no action from Congress, I think we just continue to complain every year that the situation is out of control and generally trending negatively.
I agree. And these athletes have the right, are increasingly finding that they have the right to self-help. And that means they have the right to organize. And so, you guys may have a much more optimistic view of what is potentially coming out of Congress than I do. I have none. I confess that I have absolutely no regard for anything of any value coming out of that Congress, or even the next Congress. So, and therefore, and I agree, if I'm running the NCAA, I'm going to have to say I'm on fire, and we've got to do something about it. But I don't, and they don't seem to be any more motivated than they're not sufficiently motivated given the fact that they are on fire. So I say to these students, resort to self-help. You don't have to organize, and people normally don't organize unless they view it as something that's going to be of value. And increasingly, these students are seeing it of value. The only other thing I'd say is it's not just the money, and I get it. I don't know why the universities should resist student athletes that want to talk about health and safety. There's no reason why those kinds of conversations and negotiations should not start right now, and not wait for what I think a do nothing Congress to do something. Why wait? You got look, you have the Supreme Court on your side. I think you move.
Okay, that's
Yeah,
helpful. Go ahead,
just
Gabe.
two quick follow-ups to that, and your question about don't they need an antitrust exemption? I would say two things. One, I don't think Congress is going to give an antitrust exemption unless the NCAA comes up with a plan that would require an antitrust exemption. Congress is not going to say, you're right, we need you to do your business without having to worry about being sued, and then just tell us what you come up with and hopefully it'll be good. They need to come up with a plan that says, here's how we're going to try to fix college sports. And here's what we need to do. We need to cap the money that's being spent on football. We need to cap coaches' salaries. We need to shift money towards academics, whatever it might be. All those things where you say, well, that's going to be illegal under antitrust law. You say, aha, that's why we need you to come in, because we can't do it without you. They're not going to give them a get out of antitrust jail free card. And we haven't seen that plan come out of the NCAA. As we talked about, we've seen tweaks, and Transformation Committee is not going to get an antitrust exemption based on these minor changes they're making. That's one. Two, I would say that there are things you can do at the conference level. Now, maybe you say, well, the conferences won't do it because they're all trying to compete with each other and they're not going to try to shift money away from football or from athletic success, which you may be right. But related to that, it's not as if the status quo is working very well. They are right now the target of a massive antitrust suit in the House case, and other lawsuits will probably follow. And as they continue to decentralize and loosen their restrictions, they look less and less like we think of as college sports and more like pro sports. And the more they look like pro sports and the less they look like college sports, they don't have an argument to make as to why they're entitled to different treatment under antitrust law. They don't have an argument to make that their student athletes are student athletes and not employees. So I don't know what there's left to do if you give up all of the things that you've argued for the last 100 years are necessary for your product to exist and to be different. So again, I've said this to many people and they've all said, no, we're not doing this. Put your restrictions in place. And then if you get sued, defend at least what you think is right about college sports and you think is defensible, not give it all up and then let these billions of dollars be spent not towards the educational mission. And are you going to protect yourself under antitrust law? I guess, but you're already subject, again, to hundreds of millions of dollars of damage in-house. And what do you have left to protect if you've eliminated all these rules? I don't get the NCAA's endgame right now. I just don't see if Congress is not going to help and unions are maybe not the answer, where do we go from here other than the conferences continue to get more powerful and the gap continues to widen between the major conferences and the others? I don't think the status quo is working. So do something else is my answer.
I agree. I do think, though, as soon as they do something else, they will have DOJ knocking on their door and suing them. But who knows? That all depends on exactly what they do. I promised that at the beginning that we would get to Q&A, so let's go for it. Here's one. If college athletes are allowed to unionize and negotiate pay, will they then pay for their own education? If athletes get paid and pay for their own education, is it worth the tax implications that come along with being an employee? Very few schools could afford to pay athletes and provide free education. So again, this goes to the balancing sort of question. Anybody want to comment on this or answer it?
I think it's a good question. Yes, if there's unionization and if they get paid salaries, then potentially the scholarship is converted into part of the payment and it's taxable. And it's not only income taxable, but there's Social Security tax. And the university has to pay workman's comp insurance, and they have to pay unemployment insurance. So there are a lot of costs that will be brought onto the athlete and the school's athletic department if there's a conversion of the labor market into a free labor market.
The only thing I would say is, I agree with you, Andy, but everything is subject to negotiation. So it depends upon what's negotiated. But it's certainly the case that it could be that the student is now responsible for paying his or her own tuition.
Okay. A comment just came in that, most schools do provide educational benefits to their employees, if not outright making it at no cost. I'm not sure where they're headed with that, other than to follow up on the point made earlier. So one attendee's saying it's easier to throw the NCAA under the bus than the real problem, the academic institutions, and points out that in the health and safety area, maybe we should be getting the sports medicine staff, that is athletic trainers, et cetera, out of the athletic department and under the direct supervision of physicians. Is this a solution that you think is feasible? Is this something that should be negotiated? How do we go about making this happen?
Can you clarify the medical officers would be not working for the athletic department, but what did it say? Working instead for whom?
Under the direct supervision of, I presume, independent physicians. The word independent's not there, but I presume that's what
it could mean that, or it could mean a different department of the university. I mean, the Duke trainers could report to someone at Duke University Hospital System rather than in the athletic department. So I think either interpretation may be what the questioner meant.
I think this also gets to something schools see as a good that we could potentially see as not optimal and potential, sometimes causing harm, which is like the development in the last 20 years of in-house everything, and that being, services provided to athletes that I would say in many cases are suboptimal when they could be happening in other parts of the campus rather than in-house in the athletic department. It's a function of this. We have to spend everything that's coming in, and we're competing with other colleges while we're doing it, that Andy, set us up with at the top. And like in-house athletic department academic support is another example of this, with academic counseling. And it again, like from the perspective of athletics, it's like, look, we're doing all these great things to serve our athletes, but they're not getting an educational experience that is much like other students on campus. They're missing out on those opportunities of engaging with other students and like having their eyes open to other opportunities that exist in a university environment. And the more we segregate athletes away from the rest of that university experience, it also has the potential to put, again, Black athletes in a position of more harm than help, because they're not able to interact with other parts of the campus that are intended to serve Black students and meet other Black students on that campus. And there's been research looking at how many of these policies with good intentions have the most harm for those athletes who are most vulnerable in that way. And, medical care, of course, when your salary is coming and your bosses have a lot of power from that athletic institution, you're put in a position where you might not be making decisions, whether consciously or not, that are in the best interest of the athlete, there might be a kind of platter of forces influencing that decision, whether you recognize it or not. And I think it just speaks to what Gabe was talking about earlier, that there's so much potential for opportunity and collaboration and education innovation if we're thinking about how we can serve and set up athletes for success in all realms, that there's all these other parts of the campus we could be tapping into to doing those things, and we're not. And why aren't we? And let's start now, frankly.
That's good. And I would like to clarify that we had a follow-up to that person's question. And he says that he suggests athletic medicine be housed within a student health department, a college of medicine, a college of health sciences, anything in all caps, but their athletic department. So I think we got that. It's a good point. There are a couple of questions about academics. Maybe, we could talk. Let me summarize some of them. Well, what else can be done or is being done when it comes to academics? And Gabe, I know you have some particular suggestions too you've made in writing in the past about how to tie academics more with athletics and what else can be done in this area.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there is an opportunity to, again, explore why we recognize a music major, why we recognize theater majors and encourage them to do it and find that there's real academic value there, but we don't do the same for sports. And this is not to say that we should just give academic credit for the football team because they're playing football. This is to suggest that can we figure out what are the intellectual, academic, educational opportunities that athletes are already engaging in or could better engage in to enhance their education. And I just don't, we have not done a very good job of that. We have treated it as a very different, non-serious field of academic study for the most part. And I think that can change. I think that is a way, if you look at the FLSA case, you look at what the NLRB has said, you look again what the antitrust cases say, that they think that athletics is interfering with education. Not only is it not enhancing it, it's interfering with it. So how can we better integrate the two so that when we look at the athletic experience, you say that not only you're getting a great athletic experience, but you're also getting a great academic experience. Is that going to make a difference for the top 1% of the FBS football players? Maybe not, but I think it can make a big difference for all of the athletes on campus who are spending all of this time on athletics and training and practicing. And when a musician does it, we say they're rehearsing and performing. But when an athlete does it, we say it's a countable athletic activity and don't give it any academic credit. So I think there's somewhere in between the way we treat music and the way we are currently treating athletics
But
that
there are
can
students,
better serve our athletes.
there are students trying to get a traditional education who are being thwarted. And I think somebody needs to put a lot of pressure on the NCAA or the conferences or somebody. I mean, in the Northwestern case, the young man who started the case was a quarterback on the football team, and he wanted to be a pre-med, and the coaches told him he didn't have time to be a pre-med. I mean, that ought to be a violation of something. That ought not to be permitted. And I guarantee you, there are football players graduating from Power 5 schools who don't have any NFL talent. They're very good college football players who will not earn a living on Sundays, but they're playing for Alabama or Mississippi or Notre Dame or someone who are not getting the kind of education they could get if there were some restrictions on how much time they spend on football in meetings and practices and all the rest. And the idea that now USC and UCLA are going to be in the Big Ten. So would you send your daughter, who was a field hockey player, to go to USC and UCLA, to fly across the country to Rutgers to play a regular season game? It makes no sense academically. You're spending all your time at airports and on airplanes. So there's a lot of things the D1 schools are doing which are counterproductive for education, and somebody could tell them to stop, and that would be a great improvement in the educational product without having separate and apart from what Gabe is suggesting, which is to provide courses if they want them on athletic related matters. So how about letting them learn history and English and chemistry and the traditional courses and not have their sport dominate their lives?
Okay, we're almost at the end, and I just would like to go around the horn one last time to talk about solutions, where we will be in 5 years. What will we have resolved? Will we resolve those academic problems, health and safety, the Title IX issues, the gender equity issues? What will we going to be talking about? What will we have accomplished? Andy, you want to start us off?
Well, no, but in spite of Michelle's pessimism, I'm hopeful that we'll see something coming out of Congress, maybe a modified college athletes Bill of Rights, maybe a bill coming out of a representative from Massachusetts. I don't want to reveal too much here, that talks about the establishment of a commission on intercollegiate athletics. I think that prospects are not good either through the NCAA or through the courts or through Congress, but I think they're better through Congress, and what could eventually happen is much more productive and constructive if it happens through Congress. So that's what I'm hoping for.
Excellent. Len?
I'll give you a conditional answer. If we don't have congressional action, which I think is possible but very difficult, and if we don't have unionization of at least the biggest sport, the biggest money sports, we will continue to slide in the direction we're going, which is a very bad direction. NIL will be sloppy and out of control. It's good. I love it, but it's not good the way it's being run. And education will not get any better. Health and safety won't get any better. And we could have the same discussion in 5 years and say, oh my God, you know, we still need something radical to change. And I don't see little incremental changes being helpful. I think we need the kind of revolution you would get from a bill or a commission or a broad unionization to change it.
Excellent. We're getting very low on time, but I want to get around the horn. Gabe?
Well, I mean, I'll echo what they said. I agree with both of them. Those are my predictions. I concur.
Victoria, you agree, or you have something to add there?
I mean, it's just always such a funny question because, like, I teach a history of college sports course, which will be starting in the spring. And, like, I mean, what history would tell us is that we'll continue to see tinkering. But I think Gabe is right that this moment is different for a whole slew of reasons that we've been touching on. And so we don't know. I mean, there's going to be something that will launch us on a different path. My hope is that it's a path where university leaders are involved in a redesign that prioritizes a mission of serving athletes and their holistic development.
Michelle?
I don't see anything that's more realistic for the next 5 years than a strengthening unionization movement. I'd love to be wrong because it's tough to negotiate. This whole area is very complicated. It's going to be tough to organize and tough to figure out how the units should look. But in the absence of any meaningful action by the NCAA or Congress, and I don't think that either of those entities is going to do anything, get your ballot boxes out.
Okay. Well, listen, big thanks to all of you. And on behalf of the Drake Group, I would like to invite each of you back 5 years from now to continue this discussion. And also thank you, all of you virtually, for attending. May you all stay safe and healthy and have a wonderful Thanksgiving.